My guest today is former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Mike is the author of a fantastic book on the U.S.-Russia relationship called From Cold War to Hot Peace that I highly recommend. It's great to have you. You were the first person I thought of this weekend when I read the news because for the first time in a long time, we saw overt armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I believe the first time since 2014, when Russian special forces invaded Crimea. The Russians opened fire on a Ukrainian Navy vessels. They rammed a tugboat. They seized 3 vessels and 23 sailors and closed down access to a shared waterway called the Kerch Strait, which connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov, which I totally knew that before I Googled it this morning. Mike, how worried were you when you woke up to this news? And do you think this was a planned event or a tactical interaction that went south?
Well, your second question is a harder question. I don't know the answer to that. Mm-hmm. Was it planned or just kind of happened? I think I and many other people have been watching this conflict simmer, anticipated that at some day there would be a test where Russia is trying to assert its sovereignty over this territory that you just described, right, and over this sea, and claiming this is now Russian territory. And those ships that go through that strait have to abide by their protocols, their alleged protocols. It was pretty dramatic. If you've watched the video, it's a dramatic, they're hitting this boat. And if you speak Russian like I do, it's good practice for all your swear words that you learned when you were 20 years old, because these guys are really worked up, the Russians, in this attack mode. And so that's what happened there. I think if you go to the Kremlin, Putin is now testing Ukraine. He's testing NATO. He's testing the West. He's seeing what he can get away with. It's pretty familiar to me. It's the way he operates, right? He prods and prods and sees what he can get away with. And so this is the next iteration in that prodding game.
Yeah. So I was watching some videos this morning. Putin recently inaugurated a $7.5 billion bridge across the Kerch Strait that now connects Russia and Crimea. The symbolism was so important that Putin himself drove a construction truck across the bridge on the day it opened and gave some remarks. Why is access to these waterways so important to the Russians and to their broader claims to Crimea?
Well, you're right about how important that bridge was to Putin, and it's important because it's a direct way to connect from Russia, the Russian Federation that the world recognizes, into Crimea. Before there was no direct connection between Crimea and the Russian Federation. This bridge provides that. Before you had to go through Ukraine to get to Crimea. And that's why they now having it, they are asserting for, national security reasons, they have to protect this bridge against potential espionage and sabotage and terrorist attacks from Ukrainians. But if you look at the map, your listeners, what you'll see is that you can't get to certain Ukrainian port cities without going through that strait and under that multi-billion-dollar bridge that Putin built. Mm-hmm. And so over the long run, that's going to create real economic problems for Ukraine if they can't have open passage through that strait.
Right, because Putin can just park a big tanker there and suddenly it's blocked, right?
Right, that's what he did. I mean, that's it's pretty narrow strait, and that's what he did that helped to provoke this crisis.
He is clever. So over on the Ukrainian side, President Poroshenko delivered a speech to Parliament declaring martial law that apparently starts Wednesday and goes for a month. I think he walked that back from 2 months, which is, I guess, good. He also said he had intelligence about Russian preparation for a ground offensive, which is not good. What did you make of Poroshenko's reaction, and do you share the concerns I'm seeing about him calling for martial law?
Well, I was surprised by martial law because there was not martial law back when Russia invaded in 2014. At the same time, far be it for me to sit in Palo Alto and judge what the president of Ukraine should do for defending their national security. He's obviously got intelligence that I don't have about that threat. What I thought was good, I actually think yesterday was a good day for Ukrainian democracy, in that the president said we needed martial law, and people thought, well, this is going to threaten the scheduling of the presidential election, which is scheduled for March of next year. And yet, through a deliberative process, they reached a compromise in the parliament yesterday. That's democracy at work, as far as I'm concerned. So I thought it was a good outcome, and I hope that the warnings of a Russian military invasion were, just hyperbole. But I'm not going to judge a guy sitting in Kiev with intelligence that I don't have.
Yeah, me either. So let's judge a bunch of bozos in Washington.
Okay, that's closer to home.
Much easier. Trump's response was typical and frustrating. He did a brief pool spray where he refused to condemn Russia specifically, saying, quote,
yes,
"We do not like what's happening either way," end quote. Ugh. At the UN, Nikki Haley was tougher, although she's leaving soon. She called Russia's actions a violation of international law and, quote, "an arrogant act that the international community must condemn and will never accept." Good. Pompeo condemned the act and called it a dangerous escalation and violation of international law. Curious what you made of the U.S. response and what tools you think we have at our disposal to respond beyond, I guess, statements and whatever Trump decides to say to Putin on the margins of the upcoming G20 summit in Argentina.
Well, I mean, reading the words of Ambassador Haley or the words put out under Secretary Pompeo's name, I agree with those statements. But they're undermined when the President of the United States says something differently. This is a familiar pattern now when it comes to Trump and Russia. The Trump administration seems to have one policy, but the president himself has another. And it is incredible how consistent he has been and avoiding any criticism of Vladimir Putin. I mean, years and years and years it is now going on. And remember, this is a president that changes his mind and contradicts himself fairly frequently, but not when it comes to Putin. And so, the Russian media, of course, picked up on that. They're saying, we know that this is just we were happy, I think is what Channel 1 said, with the equivocation of the president. That shows that he doesn't really want a crisis here. And I think it's a good lesson for people that words matter in diplomacy, as you may remember, Tommy, when we used to put out these words at the White House. And remember all the drama people used to have about at what level the statement was at and whether it was the White House or the State Department? Well, it
400 reply alls later.
The White House says.
Yeah, it was an absolute nightmare editing those things until they were ready to go out. You're right.
But it matters whether or not it comes from the White House or not. The whole world, and most certainly the Kremlin, is looking to see what the president says. And when given the chance to say something really simple, like we honor and defend and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, not that complex. Yeah. He whiffed. He couldn't say it.
He totally whiffed. I just saw a quote from John Bolton saying that Trump and Putin's meeting on the margins of the G20 will be a continuation of the Helsinki summit. So that's not great. That's not what I want.
Oh, that's a great news. I mean, that's the problem. So it's a great point. Like, I'm not against presidents, Democrats or Republicans, engaging with authoritarian regimes and enemies of the United States. That is something one has to do in order to advance American national interest. What the problem with Trump is that he doesn't seem capable of delivering a strong message when it comes to Putin. And we don't need any more continuations of Helsinki. I mean, Helsinki was a complete disaster in that he stood next to Putin and he defended Putin and did not defend our intelligence community. And then just to remind your listeners, that's the summit where he said it would be a great idea to hand me over to the Russians. So maybe I take it a little personal, but so far President Trump has proved incapable of advancing American national interests when he's next to Vladimir Putin. If the meeting goes forward, I hope it'll be different in Argentina, but we don't need a continuation of Helsinki. We need something different.
Yeah, well, I'm very glad they didn't hand you over and very glad that the Russians didn't get control of Interpol, which is, I guess, a conversation for another day. But seeing that our president never fails to whiff when it comes to Russia, do you think there's a chance that the UN or NATO will be able to take meaningful action that will actually deter Russia in situations like this?
UN is unlikely, of course, because Russia has a veto on the Security Council there. NATO, I think, has made the right statements, and I hope that individual NATO countries will provide more military assistance to Ukraine. And then I think the U.S. Congress should step up. There are several bills already that have been tabled for new sanctions against Russia. That was before the elections. It all got frozen because of the elections. But if the president proves unable to take more coercive actions, I think the U.S. Congress should push those bills forward and dare the president to veto them.
Yeah, that would be great to see. Final question. It's been 4 years since Russia annexed Crimea and helped create this rebellion in eastern Ukraine. The issue has dropped from the headlines, but I mean, the fighting has been ongoing between the Russians and the Russian-backed separatists ever since. And according to news reports, 10,000 people have died, 1.7 million have been displaced, millions more need urgent assistance. I mean, there was supposed to have been the Minsk agreement in 2015 that brokered a ceasefire, which has been violated countless times and was supposed to resolve this, but none of it's been enacted. Do you think, what do you think it takes to actually resolve this crisis? Like, what is missing diplomatically?
Well, I'm not optimistic because I think Putin sees it in his interest to just keep this thing going. And our instruments of leverage are weak. So that's my baseline. Having said that, I referred to these bills that are floating around both on the Senate and congressional side, the House of Representatives side, for new sanctions. And I think you have to increase sanctions for lack of momentum on Minsk, right? So there's this notion that we got to wait for them to do something negative in order to increase sanctions. I actually think it's the converse, that continued occupation of eastern Ukraine is the predicate and that should be the trigger for new escalatory sanctions. And you keep doing that, even if Putin doesn't change his behavior, right? There's this long discussion in my world, well, sanctions aren't effective, they're not working. And I think sometimes you just have to have punishment for crimes. Mm-hmm. These are crimes. These are international crimes, including what just happened 48 hours ago. And for crimes, there have to be punishments, even if it doesn't alter Putin's behavior in the short run.
Yeah. Mike, I wish you were still sitting in Moscow as the ambassador. This would be, I feel a little better about what's happening. But thank you for helping explain this to me because, I guess I'm not as nervous as I was when I woke up this weekend and read about, ships shooting at each other, right? That's a good thing. Maybe we walked it back.
They walked it back today, but Tommy, I think there's a real possibility at some point in the future that this kind of low-level simmering conflict will become hot. And Putin's going to dare us to try to stop it. And I'm worried about it. I want to be clear. We dodged a bullet, and literally Ukrainians dodged some bullets today, a couple of days ago. But this hasn't been resolved. It's not going away.
Yeah. Well, now I'm terrified again. So thank you all over.
Keep terrified, and let's keep talking.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you again.